Hi guys, welcome back. And to anyone who is new, hello, welcome. If you find yourself enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and that way the YouTube universe will tell you when to come back. So let's just get straight into it. Today's story is an older tale, and it is about a pair of infamous serial killers in Scotland. But before we get into our gruesome twosome, I'm going to set the scene for you. At the start of the 1800s in Edinburgh, man was discovering and learning so many new things. And Edinburgh would be one of the leading cities of anatomical study in Europe, along with Leiden in the Netherlands and Padua in Italy. Did I butcher those names? Probably. The pioneers of this study were Alexander Monro, John Bell, John Goodsir, and Robert Knox. We will be talking about Robert Knox a lot. These men learned by dissecting. By dissecting bodies, they were able to learn about diseases and deformities and illnesses, and ideally learn how to treat them or prevent them. It was all in the name of science. But at this time, there was a law that meant that the only bodies that these men were allowed to use for the dissections were prisoners, suicide victims, and orphans. Unfortunately, demand greatly outweighed supply. At this time, there was over 1,000 medical students in Edinburgh. So as you can imagine, they needed a lot of bodies. And the prisoners and orphans and suicide victims just weren't enough. This created a grisly new trade. Gravediggers, body snatchers, or as they would like to be called, resurrection men. And there's a funny old law that disturbing a grave is illegal, and robbing the belongings or the property of a dead person is illegal, but stealing the body isn't, because the body doesn't belong to anybody. It was quite a lucrative deal. In the summer, a body would fetch £8 because obviously in the heat it wouldn't last as long, and in the winter these people, these resurrection men, could fetch £10. Looking it up on the Bank of England website, it tells me that £10 in 1820 would be about £799 today. So, like I said, lucrative. By the 1820s, the people of Edinburgh had had enough and took to the streets to protest at the increase in grave robbing. Families who had lost loved ones had to take loads of different measures to stop the body being taken. Guards were hired to watch the graves 24/7. There was even some watchtowers built in several of the graveyards. Some families would hire a large stone slab which would be placed over the grave for a certain amount of time, and the purpose of this obviously was to allow the body to start to decompose so that it was no good to one of these doctors. Another thing used was a mort safe, and this was like an iron cage that went over the coffin. I will put up some pictures so you can see this. To be honest, you might actually think they look familiar because you see them dotted around. Historian Ruth Richardson would describe all of these actions as a growing atmosphere of crisis among the anatomists because of the shortage of bodies. And here's a quote from Tim Marshall, who will introduce us to our main fellows. Burke and Hare took grave robbing to its logical conclusion. Instead of digging up the dead, they accepted lucrative incentives to destroy the living. So let's introduce you to the trio of this gruesome twosome. There's an oxymoron for you. In 1826, Robert Knox joined the Royal College of Surgeons, Edinburgh. Knox had smallpox as a child, and so he was actually blind in one eye, and he was badly disfigured from this. Knox qualified as a doctor in 1814. He was a military surgeon in the Battle of Waterloo, and he also served in South Africa. And he joined as a lecturer, and he would also be the curator of the museum. His classes were very popular. In fact, one professor would say, quote, his hall was like Mecca. So popular that he actually had to run a second class on the same day, basically teaching the same thing because there were so many students interested. Now, there were probably a couple of reasons for this. Maybe he was brilliant and the best among his competitors, but it also seems to be because he had more bodies than his competitors. His advertising promised, quote, a full demonstration on fresh anatomical subjects. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's get on to our main fellows, William Burke and William Hare. William Burke was born in 1792 in Erney, County Tyrone. He was born to middle-class parents, and there was him and his brother Constantine. So they had a very comfortable upbringing, and then they both joined the British Army as teenagers. He would meet and marry a woman from Mayo, and this is where they would live. However, he had an argument in 1818 with his father-in-law over land ownership, and this resulted in Burke deserting his wife. Now, I read wife and family, but I don't see any mention of kids. So I think they just mean like his wife and her family, or his own family maybe. He moved to Scotland and he would become a labourer. So he actually worked on the Union Canal. So the Union Canal was basically built. It was 25 miles from Edinburgh, and it carried the Edinburgh-Glasgow Canal over the River Avon. I can put some pictures up so you can see what I mean. So this actually would have been built by a lot of Irish men who had emigrated to Scotland, to Edinburgh. He would meet a woman called Helen MacDougall, who basically became his second wife, but I believe it was just like a common law wife, and he affectionately called her Nellie. So I'm going to skip over now to William Hare. There is less information on him, specifically about where he was born and his age. So sources basically say that he was probably born in either Armagh, Derry or Newry, and like that his age was essentially not really known. When arrested in 1828, he would give his age as 21, but a lot of sources say that he was in and around the same age as William Burke. And I did read that he could have been born between 1792 and 1804. So, I mean, obviously that's quite a big range, but I do get the impression that he was a little younger than Burke. So they believe that possibly he worked as an agricultural labourer in Ireland and then emigrated over to Scotland. So he also worked on the Union Canal for a few years, and then he moved to Edinburgh in the mid-1820s. Here he worked as a coalman's assistant and as a hawker. Hare would move into a lodging house at Tanner's Close in the Westport area of Edinburgh. The man who owned the house was called Logue Laird, and his wife was Margaret. In 1826, Logue died, and Hare essentially took up with Margaret and began running the lodging house. Now, it's funny because they both worked on the Union Canal, Burke and Hare, but I don't believe that that's actually where they met each other. In 1827, it is believed that Burke and MacDougall went to Pennychuik in Midlothian, I know I'm saying that wrong, to work on the harvest, and that this is where they met Hare because he was working there. And that the two men got on, and that when they all returned to Edinburgh, they moved into Hare's lodging house. So the two couples were essentially living in the house on Tanner's Close, and the couples would get a reputation for drinking a lot and being very boisterous, very loud, very chaotic. Burke came from a middle-class family. He was described as good-looking, charming, good-humoured. In fact, when he was working as a cobbler, he was known for dancing and singing for his clients on their doorsteps while, obviously trying to sell his trade. Burke was essentially pleasant. He had nice manners, he was popular, he could dance and play an instrument, and he was a bit of a ladies' man, it seems. He was Catholic, but he became a regular worshipper in the Presbyterian religious meetings in the Grassmarket, and he was often seen with a Bible. This is just in stark contrast to Hare. So basically, one of the sources, it says that Hare was brutalised and so therefore became brutalising. He was certainly a lot more coarse, rough, working class, you might say. There is a story of an acquaintance of theirs called McLean, and it is that they all go to a pub, and as they order their drinks, they place their money down, but the barman doesn't take the money, at each go. And so at the end of their rounds, after their few drinks, Hare essentially just takes all of the money and puts it in his pocket. And everybody in the group is shocked because obviously they're like, well, it has to be paid. And Burke just simply goes up to the barman and pays him. And as they leave, McLean says to Hare, "That was a mean thing you done, making poor Will have to pay the tab." Hare would knock him down and kick him in the face. So I think that just gives us an idea of what Hare is like. So guys, we are now coming to the end of 1827, and this is where the story gets started. On the 29th of November 1827, an old soldier who lodged in the house at Tanner's Close, his name is Donald, and he died of dropsy. Now, when I googled that, it came up as edema. So if you know what edema is, it's like swelling and stuff like that. So I feel like obviously that's tying into something else that he died of. But anyway, he died. And at the time of his death, he owed £4 in rent. So Hare was furious because obviously he was now down money. Now this is where some of the inaccuracies or bits that I question are coming in. To be honest, I think Hare is worse than Burke. I think that is made clear from kind of their descriptions and stuff and things that they have done and said. So some sources will make it seem like Hare was furious and decided that the way to make the money back on what Donald owed him was to take his body and sell it to one of these doctors, the anatomists. However, some sources will make it sound like he, turned to Burke because he was a bit older and kind of questioned what he should do, what am I going to do? And that it was Burke who said, this is what we'll do, we will sell the body and this will make the money. And then some will just say that they decided together to do it. So again, we don't really know what happened, but we know that they did sell the body. So a local carpenter provided a coffin for Donald's burial, and this was actually paid for by the local parish. After the carpenter left, Burke and Hare removed Donald's body and hid it under one of the beds. They then filled the coffin with wood and bark and resealed it. They took the body to Edinburgh University. They were actually looking for Professor Monroe's office when they came across a student belonging to Knox. And obviously, he knew what they had and decided to convince them to bring it to Professor Knox's office instead. And this was on Surgeons Square. So when they arrived to Surgeons Square, there was 3 assistants there. However, Knox is the one who came and checked the body and paid them. He paid them £7 and 10 shillings. Out of this, Hare got £4 5 shilling and Burke got £3 5 shilling. As they were leaving, one of Knox's assistants said that they would be glad to see them again when they had another body to dispose of. And this would be the beginning of Burke and Hare's reign of terror. So a lot of what I'm going to say now is actually based on confessions by William Burke, which we will come to. But going through all I'm going to go through, Robert Knox would be adamant that he did not know where the bodies were coming from. And it's actually a point I just want to bring out in general with all of these anatomists. Where did they think the bodies were coming from? Because they knew that there was a shortage in terms of the prisoners and stuff like that, the legal routes. So where do they think they got the bodies from? So there is a little bit of confusion in terms of who the next victim was about dates. Because obviously Burke will confess to some of them, and then some of the historians will also kind of contradict some of these. But I'm going to go through the list of what victims we know. Now, it is believed that they had 16 victims, at least. Some people suggest or suspect that there could be more. There was a man named Joseph lodging in the house, and he became ill. He had a fever and was becoming delirious. And Hare and his wife were concerned that this might be bad for business, people might not want to stay at their lodgings. So Burke and Hare got Joseph drunk, and then they used a pillow to smother him. And the reason they believe that this was probably the next victim is because after this one, the rest would be suffocated with a hand over the nose and mouth. So essentially, for most of their victims, they got them drunk. There was a lot of drink being supplied. You had to think about rolling in the money if they had this much whiskey. One of them would sit on the victim, and this would obviously make it harder for them to struggle or fight. It also meant that as the other person covered their hand over their mouth and nose, they essentially would put the thumb under the chin, and that would hold the mouth closed, and they'd cover the mouth and nose. A lot of the sources I saw said that it was Hare who would sit across the bodies, and Burke would be the one to actually smother them. Then I came across more sources that made it the other way around, that it was Burke who lay across them, and Hare was the one who suffocated them. So whether it was a bit of both, or again, we're relying on Burke's testimony and Hare's testimony, so they might be conflicting and trying to blame the other. Obviously, this method of killing would mean that there would be no marks on the bodies when they went to the doctors, therefore cutting out any suspicion. When they brought Joseph's body to Knox, he paid them £10 this time. The next victim was a travelling salesman. He was English and he sold matchsticks and tinder. And so obviously the lodging house was very popular for salesmen, saleswomen, because, you know, they're travelling through town. They might only need to stay the one night or the 2 nights. And this man also got sick. He would actually become jaundice. And again, I was concerned that this would affect the business. So again, like Joseph, they got the Englishman drunk and then they suffocated him. The next victim was a woman named Abigail Simpson. She was a pensioner who lived nearby in the village of Gilmenton. And to supplement her pension, she would come into Edinburgh to sell salt. So she wasn't actually lodging in the house. But on the 12th of February, 1828, Burke came across her. So he invited her back to the house for some drinks. And Hare and Burke made sure that she drank so much that she just couldn't go home. She'd have to stay. And after she fell asleep, they murdered her. They would place her body in a tea chest and transport it to Knox, who again paid £10. In Burke's later confessions, he would say that, quote, Dr. Knox approved of its being so fresh. He did not ask any questions. And this is something that will be said, that he was always saying that, you know, Burke and Hare's bodies were always so nice and fresh. But again, he would deny knowing anything. In February or March of 1828, an old woman was invited into the house by Margaret Laird, or now going by Burke Hare. So I don't believe anybody actually got married. They were just common law husband and wives. But we'll call her Burke Hare just to keep it simpler. So she invited this old woman into the house and she was given enough whiskey to fall asleep. And then when Hare returned later that day, he covered the sleeping woman's mouth and nose with something called a tick. And this was like a stiff mattress cover. And so apparently he just covered her with this. And by the time nightfall came, she was dead. Burke would then help Hare to transport the body in the tea chest to Knox, who again paid £10. In early April, Burke met 2 women called Mary Pattison, who was also known as Mary Mitchell, and her friend Janet Brown, in the Canongate area of Edinburgh. So it says that he bought the women some alcohol and then invited them back to the lodging house for breakfast. It seems like maybe he is a bit of a ladies' man, and he had met them in a pub or a tavern. They left here with 2 bottles of whiskey and actually went to his brother Constantine's house. So when his brother left for work, Burke and the 2 women, Mary and Janet, finished the whiskey, and Mary would fall asleep at the table. Burke and Janet would continue to talk, but Burke's wife come upon them and accused them of having an affair. There would be a fight between Burke and MacDougall, and he threw a glass at her, cutting her above the eye. At this point, Janet said that she did not know that Burke was married, and she left. It's said that MacDougall also left and went to get Hare and his wife Margaret. When they arrived, the 2 men locked the wives out of the room and they murdered Mary Pattison in her sleep. They would again put her into the tea chest and head over to Knox. MacDougall would keep her skirt and petticoats. For this body they were paid £8, and it was still warm when they delivered it. Now, I read that Mary Pattison was a prostitute, and one of Knox's assistants, Ferguson, had been with her just in the days before. And so when the body came, he recognised her and asked, "How did you get this body?" Burke would say that the girl had drank herself to death and that they had purchased it from an old woman in Canongate. Again, Knox was delighted with the body because it was so fresh, and he was able to store it in whiskey for 3 months before needing to dissect it. When Janet Brown would later come back looking for her friend, she was told that she had left for Glasgow with a travelling salesman. A while after this, another woman, Mrs. Haldane, who was described as a stout old woman by Burke, was lodging at the house. She became drunk and fell asleep in the stable, so she was smothered and sold to Knox. Months later, her daughter Margaret would also lodge at the house, and again she was drinking, so her and Burke drank together heavily, and then he killed her without Hare. Again, her body was put into the tea chest and taken to Knox, where Burke was paid £8. In May 1828, another old woman came to the house as a lodger. And again, one evening while she was drunk, Burke smothered her. And again, Hare was not present in the house for this one. Burke would receive £10 from Knox this time. So I suppose there are a few where Burke is doing them without Hare, but then there will be some that Hare does without Burke. So I suppose it wasn't always like the two of them doing it. If they both got an opportunity, they took it. It feels like everybody was just drunk all the time and they just took advantage of it. Anytime someone was so drunk that they just couldn't hold themselves, manage themselves, it was just easy for them to smother them. And typically, I suppose this was women more so, especially maybe because women are probably more slight and more likely to become drunk and less likely to be able to fight them off. So then a woman who was familiar to Burke, her name was Effie, and she was a cinder gatherer. So she would go through like bins and rubbish tips and stuff to try like then sell what she found. So she had actually sold scraps of leather to Burke when he was a cobbler. So when he met her one day, he tempted her back to the house with some whiskey. Although it seems like they went into the stable. So again, I really think maybe Burke was a proper little ladies' man. Or a philanderer. When Effie was drunk enough, Burke and Hare smothered her. And again, they got £10 for the body. So remember I said it was like nearly just basically practically under £800 today. So like it's a lot of money every time they're doing it, if they're doing like every week or every 2 weeks. Like I read that Burke made £1 a week when he was a cobbler. So it just shows you how much money this was. And it was, I suppose in a way, easy work. Burke, the opportunist, saw a woman who was very drunk being helped back to her lodgings by a police officer, when Burke then offered to take her there himself. The policeman agreed to this and allowed him to take her. So obviously he took her back to the house and killed her and got another £10. I don't know why that policeman was like, yeah, sure, stranger, you take her. Like, imagine them doing that today. In June 1828, Burke and Hare would murder 2 lodgers. There was an old woman and a dumb boy, her grandson. This is what Burke would later recall. So while the boy sat by the fire in the kitchen, the grandmother was murdered in the bedroom by being smothered. I don't know if it was that they had gotten her drunk or did they just kind of overpower her. Burke and Hare then picked up the boy and carried him into the same room and he was killed. Burke would later say in his confessions that this was the murder that disturbed him the most. He was haunted by the expression on the boy's face. So the tea chest that Burke and Hare usually used to transport their victims was not big enough for both bodies. So instead, they put them both into a herring barrel and they used Hare's horse to carry it down to Knox. However, the horse refused to carry the heavy load any further than Grassmarket, and the men had to call a porter to help them transport it on a cart. Burke and Hare would receive £8 each for the grandmother and grandson. Hare, a brutal man as it was furious at this inconvenience, and when they got back to the lodging house, he shot his horse dead. So another thing I came across with Hare being, the despicable scoundrel that he was, while him and Burke were talking one day, maybe they were struggling to find another victim or something, but Hare suggested Burke's wife, Helen, as a victim. And it says kind of that, like, Burke defended her and then offered up her cousin instead. Again, this dynamic just seems so weird because why wouldn't you just be like, give over? Like, what are you talking about? Instead of having to say, okay, well, I'll get someone else instead of my wife. Instead of it just being, no, let's just kill another lodger. I think that's I think it's a weird dynamic. Definitely makes me think that Hare was, in charge, but you can let me know what you think. We are now on the 24th of June, and William Burke and Helen MacDougall head off to Falkirk to visit Helen's father. Now, at this point, Hare was short on cash, and Burke knew this because he had even had to pawn some of his clothes. But when they returned, Hare was wearing new clothes and had extra money. But Hare would deny that he sold another body. But Burke checked with Knox, who told him that Hare had given him a woman's body and that he paid £8 for it. So this led to a fight between the two men and it actually became physical. Now, I think that's weird because, again, Burke done this where he, killed women and got money for them without Hare being involved. So it's weird then to be annoyed for Hare doing it. However, like that, the fight became physical and Burke and his wife then moved out of the lodgings and into the home of his cousin John Brogan, which was only 2 streets away. However, the argument between the two did not last very long, and by late September or early October, Hare was visiting Burke when a woman, Mrs. Hostler, a washerwoman, came to the property to do some laundry. As usual, the men got her drunk and they killed her. And by that afternoon, the body was with Knox. Again, they received £8 for this woman. Or Anne Dougal, who was Helen's cousin that I told you about, that Burke essentially had to sacrifice in place for his wife. She would visit, whether this was arranged or this just happened to be coincidence. She was visiting from Falkirk, and the men would kill her by their usual technique, and they received £10 for her body. However, another source actually says that it wasn't Hare, but his wife Margaret, who suggested killing Helen because they couldn't trust her as she was a Scotchwoman. We are now in November 1828, and the next victim was a boy called Daft Jamie. His name was James Wilson, and he was an 18-year-old man with a limp. He had a deformity on his feet. He had a mental disability, and so he was known locally as Daft Jamie. He was quite a big lad. He would live on the streets and beg. So Hare lured Daft Jamie into the lodgings with the promise of some drink. He then told Margaret to go get Burke. The two men led Jamie into a bedroom and the two began to smother him. However, as I said, he was quite big, quite strong, so it actually took the two men to really hold him down. He was able to fight back against them, but eventually they managed to smother him. His body was stripped and the few possessions he had on him were taken, including a snuff box and a snuff spoon. When the body was given to Knox the following day, both the doctor and his students recognised Wilson. And this is interesting because when some of his students said that they recognised it to be Daft Jamie, he said that it couldn't have been anyone they knew. And when it started being spoken about that Daft Jamie had gone missing, Knox dissected his body ahead of others that were still in storage. He removed the head and feet before using the body for the main dissection.